Welcome to the Praxis Report. I'm your host, William Barth.
I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brown.
And today we're here for the relaunch of the Praxis Report at a very important moment in history, namely the inauguration of a new American president, Donald J. Trump. So the Praxis Report concept, which is to combine political theory and practice, is particularly important at this moment in history. And though, so many podcasts on politics and news events talk about events of the day and comment on them, what really distinguishes the Praxis Report is that we try to theorize the political challenges that we face with scholarly theory. And then we try to provide practical solutions of what can be done in light of the challenges that we face. And that's what makes the Praxis Report a bit different. And of course, again, today we're facing truly unique challenges. We have the MAGA Trump Republicans who most liberal Democrats just cannot stand. Democrats consider the MAGA populist forces as racist or anti-statist or
fascist even.
Or fascist, whereas the MAGA forces who support Donald Trump and his movement consider liberal Democrats hopelessly woke and identitarian and completely out of touch with the working class. And then you have this sort of third wing called the so-called third party movement, the largest being the libertarian movement, which most third party sort of advocates don't realize. The libertarians are the largest third party in the United States, but also the Green Party, and then a large independent movement with figures like Cornel West and Bernie Sanders. And what distinguishes that movement are two things. One, it's the largest political force in the country. Most voters do not identify as Democrats or Republicans. They identify as independents or potentially third parties. However, the third party movement and the independent movement has proved to be very politically weak. They've been largely marginalized. They're divided. And the major parties, particularly the Democratic Party, take strategic actions to limit the ability of third parties to compete. They sue the third parties. They try to keep third parties off of the election ballot. So we're really in a conundrum. The Republican and Democratic duopoly parties are unsatisfactory. The alternative to those are also marginalized and divided, and we're really in a quandary. And that's what we here at the Praxis Report can offer, some kind of theorization of this problem, and then try to provide a path forward. Some kind of practical path forward of how we can meet these challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to you, John, and maybe you can comment on this.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant introduction. And to give our listeners an idea, this term praxis, this is a term that actually goes back all the way to Aristotle, but it's basically it means the blending together of theory and action. So practice and theory. And there's a great quote, Lenin said, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement." H. Rap Brown in the 60s said that, help me with the quote here. It was
the quote is, "The application of theory is the proof of theory."
Exactly. Okay.
You may have a good idea, and it may be a good idea, but it may not work.
That's right. So we're trying to
you've got to start with what works.
Right. And we're trying to do that with this show. We want to not just be sort of armchair philosophers about politics here, but we want to take the knowledge that we're producing through our study and apply it to the real world so that we can actually change the political situation in the United States. We all know the politics are corrupt. Political situation is not working. The government and major institutions in America are deeply unpopular. The quality of life for the average citizen is declining every year. And so we're here to try to provide not just a theory, not just an armchair philosophy, but an actual way of solving the question.
That's right, John. I was going to mention, first of all, in terms of that problem, with that recent article that came out and that some candidates talked about, 40% of all Americans cannot afford a $400 emergency. They do not have the funds to cover a $400 emergency if your car breaks down or any other emergency. That's how desperate the situation, and that's how unaffordable the United States of America is as a place to live. But what I also wanted to mention is that most pundits will talk about, well, I'm just not going to vote for the Democrat or Republican. I'm going to vote for the third party. But if it's not a realistic, strategic, and practical approach to changing things, then it's just a kind of a protest or a marginalized effort that can't bring social change. And we don't want that effort to be marginalized and just symbolic. We want to bring real change, and I think that's where we as kind of analysts differ from your average podcast.
Right. I mean, I think both of us have been sympathetic to the Green Party and the Libertarian Party to certain extents, and to people like Cornel West, in that we recognize the value of them trying to break up the two-party duopoly, the two-party system. But we also are getting to a point where we realize that these parties have been functioning a bit as like a vanity campaign or a protest vote that is not actually able to break through. And so that leaves us where we are today, which is the election of Donald Trump. And Trump, for all his problems and flaws and corruption and all the bad things people on the left say about Trump, Trump was able to harness the MAGA movement, which is a sort of blue collar industrial working class that is disgruntled and disaffected by the changes of the neoliberal capitalist period, with the endless wars in the Middle East, the deindustrialization of manufacturing jobs, and the declining standard of living and the absolute corruption of the government. So with Trump's promise that, drain the swamp and get rid of the deep state and tell the press that they're all fake news, those things resonate with the working class base across the country. And as you mentioned, they are angry about the sort of liberal Democrats. They're also angry, a lot of the MAGA people, about the establishment Republicans. So Trump rode into office on that basis, but it's an open question if Trump is going to actually do anything to benefit the working class in America, or if he's going to be a con man that will speak in a populist rhetoric while pursuing the same neoconservative establishment politics that he himself pretended to be against.
Yeah, like it's a smart political strategy because he's using the right sort of mantle of populism, attacking the so-called deep state, attacking the duopoly, attacking the military-industrial complex and wars, and to that extent, he has it right. But of course, the actual reality of it, and these are the kinds of issues that you and I can analyze. We know that he's a hypocrite and he's a con artist. He's had a career at being a sort of at that sort of thing and in that sort of practice. He talks about draining the swamp and then appoints a cabinet comprised of multi-billionaires who have completely corrupted the entire electoral system. So but at the same time, he's smart to assume that populist mantle, and in terms of he sees the value of the peace mantle, because I think peace and the peace coalition, as we talked about on prior podcasts, we talked about the need for a peace front, a coalition of all groups and parties in support of peace is the issue. In almost every election, the candidate of peace is the popular candidate. Peace is very popular with the voters, and peace also is an issue that sort of represents what ails our society, broadly speaking. Not only because we're on the brink of a global thermonuclear war in any one of these war theaters, whether in Gaza or Ukraine or Taiwan, but also it also reveals how the military-industrial complex and the economic substructure that controls our politics and our economy which so many of the radicals and revolutionaries of the 60s talked about, it reveals that aspect of things.
Right.
So that's why peace is a smart electoral issue. If you look at election after election, I think Obama, when he ran for office, ran as the candidate of peace against the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
Clinton, when he ran, he came out of he wasn't an anti-war leader, but he saw the value of being against the war and being anti-war in his own campaigns. So
Right.
peace is always popular. And of course, the most important political figure of the probably the 20th century, in the modern 20th century, is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and his whole administration was sort of based on this idea that war as an enterprise is no longer a valid strategic enterprise because nuclear holocaust, the threat of mutually assured destruction and
Right.
annihilating the entire planet with nuclear weapons, makes war irrelevant. And in other words, the nuclear war can never be fought and can never be won, should never be fought and can never be won because it just obliterates human society, full stop. So, and Kennedy had a whole string of initiatives: the nuclear test ban treaty, the Peace Corps, and as we've said in prior podcasts, John Kennedy's whole theme was he's reported as saying that the key role, the key duty of the president of the United States is to keep the country out of war.
Well,
That's
look at what
and that's something that Trump understands
right. The
and to his
last
credit has
25 years
implemented.
of American politics, when we look back since the 21st century, has been defined by the neoconservative war machine, the war on terror, the global war on terror. And that is a big reason why politics has shifted in this MAGA direction, because the left today is or at least the Democratic Party, has fully embraced the pro-war, pro-imperialist, neoconservative agenda. I think now would be a good time to bring up this poll. This is the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project, and this is a remarkable finding. So the new poll shows that Gaza was a top issue for Biden.
I think you need to, if you can go to the next.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you
Right
go.
here. So when they asked voters who supported Biden in 2020 but voted against Harris in 2024, what was the most important issue? 29% said ending Israel's violence in Gaza. 24% said the economy. So the two largest issues, and I would say those two are connected, the whole guns versus butter argument.
That's right. That's something we need to discuss and unpack a little bit.
See, like the idea that the war machine is spending billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, funding weapons into Ukraine, funding weapons into Israel, overthrowing Assad's government in Syria, pushing for war with China and Taiwan. And at the same time, America, like you said, the American people can hardly afford to pay their bills, can't pay rent. There's massive increase in homelessness under the Biden administration. So all of these problems, we can't help our own people. Our own society is crumbling. Right in California, Will, where you live, there's wildfires that are destroying everything.
Correct.
Biden is sending more money to Israel as he leaves office, but he can't put out the fires in Los Angeles. So this is a huge issue that I think ultimately cost the Democrats the election in 2024.
It is, and it's an issue that has not been discussed by the pundits. The issue of war, full stop, a war qua war, has not been fully discussed, I think, by the punditry, and it's something that has not been given enough attention. War has so many unforeseen consequences. Of course, first and foremost is the moral question. And that's something Trump, to his credit, has discussed. Just mass murder. The mass murder in Ukraine, and obviously the literal genocide that's taking place in Gaza. With the Lancet report, which I think we might have a copy of that, John. I don't know if you have a snapshot of it, but Lancet reported over, I think it's 183,000 deaths in Gaza now, Gazans dead as a result of the war on Palestine, a country that is not a sovereign UN member state, by the way. So we can get into that question
Right, right. And
later in the next episode. But
and
the
when you
point I
say
want to
that
make is
when you say
war
this
has,
about lethal, yeah,
yeah,
when you say this about lethal, about how deadly the wars are, and it's a moral question, reminds me that during the election, we shouldn't forget Kamala Harris uh, was endorsed by Dick Cheney, the bloodthirsty sociopathic architect of the Iraq War and the War on Terror,
and Afghanistan.
and
Right.
liberals ate it up because they thought it was so great that this neoconservative Republican went against Trump. And during her inauguration speech at the Democratic convention, she said she pledged to create the most, quote, lethal military in the world. And
Right.
and Trump, in his speech, he mentioned the danger of nuclear war, the danger of World War III, the danger of war itself. That's something that Trump spoke on that the Democrats do not have any interest in, other than pushing for more war.
And by the way, that's a sea change in terms of politics, because that is
Right.
so, if you look at the whole politics of the 1960s and beyond, the progressive, all the way into almost the end of the 20th century, the Democrats, in terms of issues like détente with the Soviet Union and communist China. And that was not only Democrats, but Richard Nixon and the Republican Party. They led the effort towards
Peaceful.
détente.
Yeah.
And also, again, ending the threat of a nuclear holocaust. That was always led by Democratic progressive leaders in the Democratic Party, particularly John Kennedy and later and other leaders after that. However, as you say, it's almost as though the anti-war wing or anti-war movement of the 60s, led by people like Tom Hayden and Cesar Chavez and Jesse Jackson and Martin Luther King Jr., Michael Harrington, all these great leaders, Robert F. Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, uh, defeated, completely defeated. And the war wing of the party, led by Lyndon Johnson, who was disgraced in his presidency because of the war on Vietnam, which was talk about genocidal wars.
Right.
It's just incredible that the Vietnamese people consider the United States such a close friend, given what we did to that country in terms of mass death and the napalm bombing of the country and almost destruction of it. So nonetheless, the pro-war wing and the military-industrial complex, these huge corporations that profit from war and that fund political campaigns, prevailed.
That's right.
And Trump was, to his credit, was smart to see it and to make it the key issue in his campaign. And now we have a poll that confirms that war was in fact the issue that hurt Harris and caused her to receive something like 17 million less votes than Biden, more than any other issue, more than the economy, more than anything. The war on Palestine, where they call Gaza, which is part of Palestine,
Right. Well,
so.
we have, you're right. We've seen this transformation. The Democratic Party and the left have completely ignored the issue of war, and they also, connected to that, have ignored the issue of economics. The Democrats with Harris did not run a campaign focused on the economy or the war. Their focus was essentially on two things. One would be that they were not Trump, that Trump is an unprecedented threat to democracy. And so they ran a campaign that, hey, vote for us because we are not the Republicans. And also just based on the identity categories of Kamala Harris being a Black woman. And those two things, identity and we're not Trump, are not strong enough arguments for voting for the Democrats, especially when the Democrats have now fully embraced the war machine. and have
That's
gone
right.
full steam ahead. Uh,
And and you see them losing incredible support in the African American community and in the Latino community. So that most shocking.
right,
Uh,
Hispanic men, I believe, Trump got a
pardon
large
me.
increase in the votes among Hispanic men.
Correct. Huge increases in the Latino vote, and also large increases in amongst African American, particularly African American men.
I think there's a certain contradiction with Trump is that among his base, I think that and I can remember this from the Iraq War protests. There always has been a libertarian and populist conservative critique of foreign policy. They believe that the war is the health of the state. It's a statist enterprise of expanding the power of the government.
Correct.
They want to put America first over foreign entanglements. And that was a big part of the anti-war movement in the early 2000s when Bush was president. Today, with the MAGA supporters, that is still a concern that the foreign wars, the entanglements, and not putting infrastructure back into the United States. Whereas the left has dropped that issue and has actually embraced a sort of liberal interventionism where they look at things like Ukraine and Taiwan and Syria, and they want to actually go around and overthrow other countries' governments. And they will justify it using their identity politics and humanitarianism and the threat of evil China, evil Russia. So it's actually remarkable that the new Cold War against China and Russia have been built by Democrats and
Right.
liberals.
And we saw with the fall of the Soviet Union what was supposed to be a peace dividend. In other words, now
Yeah.
that the world was no longer under the threat of a sort of ideological and strategic confrontation between communism and capitalism, so-called,
Right.
that we could now we no longer needed even half the military capability that we once had. And of course, this was a threat to the corporations that produce these military weaponry, the Lockheed Martins and Raytheons and so forth. Somehow the military industrial complex had to resurrect, in effect, a new Cold War. Now that the Soviet Union
Right.
had brought to an end,
And that's
initially it
where
was
the
going to
war on
be.
terrorism
Yeah,
came
yeah, it
from.
was initially going to be the war on terror, but these were, small countries. These are primarily Islamic sort of resistance movements led by really what were colonies throughout the Arab world. That was a
Yeah.
colonized world, and these Islamic movements are sort of resistance movements trying to liberate, in a sense, the Arab world from colonialism and neocolonialism, just like happened in Africa, throughout all of Africa, and throughout all of Asia in the 60s. But
Well, yeah, and if we could just add too, historically, the uh, Arab nationalist movements that were secular and socialist were supported by the Soviet Union in the mid 20th century, and originally the
that's
United States
correct.
was instrumental in trying to fund and play up the Islamic extremist elements as a sort of counterbalance to the secular socialist elements. For example, funding the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan to attack the Soviets, and that ended up snowballing into
Al
now
Qaeda. Al
Al
Qaeda.
Qaeda and the war on terror. But I still think Islam is playing a revolutionary role, even if it's not secular or socialist today in that sense. It's not Marxist Leninist per se, but it still plays a revolutionary role in the sense that Islam is the vehicle for anti-imperialist, anti-colonial
Correct.
struggles in the Middle East.
That's
And,
right.
and,
It's anti neo colonial,
right.
and as we see in Israel, most Israelis who my my Jewish brothers and sisters hate when I do this, but I always have to remind them that most Israelis, if you're pro-Israel, it means you're pro Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, because most people who live in Israel are are Arab Israelis, or what they call now in the modern period Palestinians. I mean, the whole term, even the idea of Palestinian nationalism during the 60s was hardly developed. I mean, we referred to Palestinians as simply Arabs. In other words, the Arab peoples were identified like African Americans were in the United States by their skin color. We used to call African Americans Negro. In other words, we would identify this national group as a racial group, as if they had no nation or no national history. They were simply a race, and that is how the sort of the West and the whole movement to create Israel characterized the indigenous populations of current day Israel or Palestine as in other words, Palestinians were identified racially or ethnically as simply Arabs, and most people who live in Israel are Arab. I think the actual population numbers, if you include Jerusalem, and most Jewish community folks would consider Jerusalem part of Israel, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, and of course Gaza, which is part of Israel, although most Israeli supporters deny this, because certainly Gaza is located in no other country or sovereign UN member state.
Right.
Yes, Arab Israelis or Palestinians, using the modern profiling, are the majority population of Israel. And if you're pro-Israel, then you're pro-Arab Israeli or pro-Palestinian. You can't get around it. And this is the dilemma, the conundrum of the Middle East conflict. If you're pro-Israel, you have to be pro-Arab, and you can't separate the two. And unless you actually genocide or expel the
Well, I
entire
think that's
population, and that's the goal of the current regime that sort of runs things in Israel.
I think that's the problem with our Jewish brothers and sisters who are Zionists. They are pro-Israel in the sense that they want an ethno state without any of the Palestinians there. And yet look what happened in the last 2 years. You know, Yemen, the Houthis, and in Gaza, Hamas, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and of course Iran, who is a sort of regional power that is counterbalance to Israel. Those were the primary forces that were able to stand up in some way to inflict some kind of resistance against the Zionist regime in Israel. And that is a revolutionary force in its ability to provide a counterbalance to the hegemony of the United States and its client regime in Israel from being able to just wipe out the Palestinians without any sort of pushback. And that is a big reason why the US wants to take out Iran, why Israel wants to take out Iran. And of course, recognizing that Russia, China, and other larger states are providing a counterbalance to the US hegemony over the Middle East. And that's something that we really need to recognize is the war on terror was no longer really enough of these were small states, and a lot of the terrorist groups were stateless actors who were just different resistance groups that were transnational in a way. And it's not the same as the Soviet Union fighting against a large superpower. So now we have this sort of rising multipolar world where we have Russia, we have China, who are large countries that are growing and outpacing the United States in many ways. So now the war on terror has shifted to what would you call this? A new Cold War, if we will.
Right. And but again, the military-industrial complex had to resurrect the Soviet threat in some form to justify its multi-billion-dollar existence. I mean, half the federal budget funds that military-industrial complex, and that military-industrial complex provides an important basis for our economy, the entire economy. So it had to resurrect a threat to replace the Soviet Union, and incredibly, that has been successfully achieved with the Russian Federation and this renewed war in Ukraine. And again, getting back to the economy, the two are fundamentally linked. War and the economy are fundamentally interlinked. So when you have war in Ukraine, what you're talking about, the breadbasket of the entire of all of Europe. And when you're talking about war on the Russian Federation, you're talking about massive disruption to the global energy markets. So
Right.
creating gas and oil inflation, energy inflation, and so forth. So you have this unforeseen consequence, which we call inflation, taking place. And no one ever discusses the connection between this unforeseen consequence of inflation with the war system. And so I think that's the importance of war as a central issue, or the importance rather of a peace initiative, as being central to any kind of meaningful uh, effort at political change.
Yeah, and that reminds me, it's Trump's inauguration today, but it's also, ironically, Martin Luther King Day,
Yeah, I
and
think I have
you have
Martin
the
back
photo there.
behind me.
Yeah,
So
but that's a good segue into thinking about Martin Luther King, because some people would probably say it's crazy. Trump and Martin Luther King, Trump to the liberals is the ultimate Nazi fascist white
that's
nationalist.
right. That's
But
right.
one thing that's important to remember is that Martin Luther King was he's largely been sanitized and whitewashed today. But his campaign, he always said that he saw the three great evils in modern American society. The three great evils is racism, capitalism, and militarism. And he even said that
It's materialism,
materialism, right?
militarism, and racism.
Right. And materialism in the sense of greed, wealth, power,
Yes,
lust for money. And and
yes.
and these are the things that he critiqued in society, that he saw the interconnections between capitalism and racism and imperialism. He saw the three things as interrelated, and even said he thought the US government was the greatest perpetrator of violence in the world.
Right,
At-
and you have to remember that one of the great criticisms of King, and probably the most controversial thing he did, was when he left, in a sense, the civil rights movement as being exclusively a movement to desegregate Southern states and end the segregation laws, which basically governed the lives of African Americans in the United States, and subjugated African Americans in the United States. To leave that struggle and criticize and oppose the war on Vietnam. That was a
Right.
very controversial moment. King was criticized both within the civil rights movement and within politics generally, and even criticized in the Black community for his opposition to the war in Vietnam. But King
Yeah.
said he could not campaign for desegregation and an end to the segregation regime and civil rights in the United States without also almost concurrently opposing the war machine and the war effort, because somehow the two movements were inextricably bound up together. An injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere, something like that. I can't, I'm not as eloquent as King was in defining
No,
it,
I think
but
that's it.
he tied it together
Yeah.
brilliantly.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's something we need to bring back today. That and not to mention, liberals, I would say, are the opposite of King. The Democrats embrace racism, they embrace war, they embrace capitalism. And the Democrats would say, no, we're anti-racist. We're the party of identity politics. And
Explain that a little bit. How are they racist?
well, I think the Democratic Party operates under a false definition of racism. They believe in a sort of what some Black Marxists would say. We want to put Black faces in high places. So they sort of operate from a position of, let's seek to integrate a few Black people into the ranks of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, and have Black people in the media and Hollywood and on TV, while at the same time the Democrats pursue an economic agenda and a political agenda that disenfranchises, exploits, and oppresses the majority of the Black masses, who are disenfranchised, who are poor, who are working class, who are
Correct.
struggling with police violence and incarceration.
Right.
And those are things the Democratic Party completely ignores. As we know, Biden was one of the architects of the mass incarceration.
Mass incarceration.
And
Correct.
Kamala Harris was a attorney general in California, was known for being very quote unquote tough on crime.
Right.
So the Democratic Party uses its kind of monopoly on saying we own the black vote and the black constituency, while they actually have been making life worse in terms of the quality of life for the black community as a whole.
So, John, can we somehow sum up kind of some of the things we discussed just in this segment,
Yeah.
and can you maybe help us? What lesson have we learned from the election of Donald Trump, and what's the practical uh, thing that we can do, or the practical strategy that people who care about progress and civilization and humanity can take in light of kind of what we've discussed?
Yeah, I think the big takeaways first is we discussed why the Democrats lost, which, as we both agree, it's the Democrats lost because of their commitment to war, especially the genocide in Gaza, and secondly, their um, failure to help the economy for average Americans. So Trump's victory, in a large part, was because he was able to capture this populist attitude. Now, Trump himself being a sort of fraudulent populist, a pseudo populist who's
Right. Con artist.
a con artist who's,
Yeah,
of course, he, as we said, he's staffing his administration with billionaires and
that's
different
right.
establishments.
He talks about challenging the swamp, and then he puts the swamp in charge of his whole administration. But that's sort of
Right.
a secondary issue. He
Yeah.
certainly has his pulse on the right, the periphery of it, the
Yeah.
image of it. He just, in reality, it's quite different. But that's still, you have to give him credit for what he's done, for what he's achieved. He understands the issue.
Right. And I think that what we've touched on is that the issue of war and the issue of the economy, those are the two largest questions. And in that regard, obviously neither party is actually doing anything to help that issue. But Trump rhetorically is speaking to those concerns, while the Democrats are completely off in the wrong direction.
Right, but to his credit, again, if Trump actually successfully ends those wars somehow,
Yeah.
uh, then you have to give him not only credit where credit's due. Again, I've seen articles of people authors suggesting that Trump will earn a Nobel Peace Prize,
For
and I
ending
think
the
that
war.
will.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that will cement Trump's political popularity in the near future if he is able to end those wars, because I think there will be an economic benefit of sorts from his ending the war. Of course, what Trump does, his anti-war position is not a true anti-war position, in the sense that he's not really taking on the military-industrial complex. If anything, he's going to, I think, make it more powerful and fund it even more, because he calls it peace through strength, which means even more funding for the military industrial complex and more power for the military industrial complex. But to his credit, again, if he ends the mass murder, what they call the scourge of war, the 180 some thousand Palestinians or Arab Israelis who are now mass murdered in greater Israel and Gaza and the West Bank and these other areas, and again a horrific war in Ukraine, which has brought just again so much mass death
Yeah.
on both sides. If Trump ends that, then he's really managed to capture the peace mantle, and he's the only force that has done so up to now. So
Right. And I think, the true revolutionary force is obviously not Trump or Biden or Harris or any f- political establishment leader like that, but
that's
the
right.
revolutionary force is the American people, the masses and the workers. And so Trump's only ability to succeed was because he was able to at least rhetorically tap into that. But if we agree Trump is a pseudo populist or a fraudulent populist, then the answer is for us to build a real populism, a real movement that is of the masses, of the people.
Right. And I notice you don't particularly take an opinion as to whether or not, oh, we should all join the Democratic Party or we should all join the Green Party, or should we go with Dr. Cornel West's independent effort. Although, full disclosure, I supported Cornel West in the last election, although he wasn't even on the California ballot. So I don't even know how.
Well, that's
how
a no,
yeah, that's kind of a
it's a
problem.
protest vote, but I mean, I don't know as far as electoral strategy. That's a difficult question, but I'm in
Yeah.
the
But so you haven't centered. You're talking about sort of a movement outside of electoral activities, as embodied by or represented by the Democratic Party or the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or the Independents. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, formally, I'm a member of the American Communist Party, and I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we will need a party that is a communist party to lead this populist movement that I'm talking about. A party that can be the most theoretically advanced revolutionary strategy to lead the masses and to work directly with the masses. But as far as being at a level of a mass political electoral force, we do not have, a mass communist movement in the United States at this time, given our history with the Cold War and the Red Scare and all of that. But I
Right.
think that building some kind of, what I would call socialism with American characteristics, a new type of socialism that is socialism rooted in America's history and culture and its own unique context, that I think would be the direction to get us out of this mess.
Right. So you don't endorse a particular electoral strategy, or we don't have one to offer at this time. In other words, let's all join the Green Party, or let's all join the Democratic Party, or as you suggest, even another option, not only an independent movement, but an actual communist party, which we'll have to get into at probably a later episode, because
Yeah.
that has implications that is rarely discussed on any podcast, and it's meritorious. It deserves discussion. All of these approaches deserve what we call theorization, and let's unpack them all, so we can have a meaningful strategy for change. Because right now, in the current day, we do not have one. We do not have an effective progressive strategy unfortunately at the current political moment.
No.
And that's how we're left with Donald Trump as our new American president. And maybe that's a good note to
Right. Yeah, like you always
conclude with.
say, if the left has failed, then that leaves Trump as the only game in town.
He's the only game in town. Yeah.
uh, but that's a
Well,
good
that's an old political adage, and
right, right.
because politics is about, sort of the political game is about the practice. What can be done given
Right.
the current situation? What can be done? And politics always is very practical in that sense. It asks, well, you had two candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and one was just more popular and did better than the other. And again, Kamala Harris outspent Trump, had to have the money, had all these endorsements from even, as you point out, very extremist right wing militaristic Republicans. Look what
Right.
happened. Look what happened.
Well, that's a good note to end on, I think. If do you have any final concluding thoughts?
No, I think we've covered a lot of territory, and I
Yeah,
think we at least proposed that the initial conclusion is we have some organizing to do.
that's right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. We are the Praxis Report, and our goal here is to connect theory to action. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today on Trump's inauguration. And if you liked the video, please like our channel, leave us a comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon if you want to support us.
Peace,
Till
y'all.
see you next time, guys.